share no stories, just something in your eyes. Don't be afraid, the shadows know me. Let's leave the world behind.
Hi, my name is Chris and I want to introduce myself to you and to my channel. I've been living in my RV full-time now for the past 8 months, and I want to give you a sense for why I've decided to do this. About 5 years ago, I lived in the Pacific Northwest. I'd lived there for many years, and the rising cost of living in that area had finally gotten to the point where I just didn't feel it was worth living up there anymore. And so cost is one of the reasons why I've decided to live in an RV. A lot of people are struggling with the cost of housing. It's just gotten to be astronomically expensive, even in places where it used to be relatively expensive. One of the other reasons I've decided to live in an RV is for a creative outlet. That may sound kind of funny, but I've always been a creative person. I'm a graphic artist by training and trade, and I've really decided that I've needed some new sort of creative outlet. So I'm going to begin exploring in my RV. When I initially got the RV, I thought, well, maybe I'm just going to live in it so I can live in it cheaply. It's like Bob Wells' website, Cheap RV Living. And it dawned on me that it would actually make sense not just to find some place to live like an RV park and pay cheap rent, but to actually take advantage of it and go out and explore. The third reason why I've chosen to live in an RV is to help overcome fears. And this one is actually kind of a big deal for me. For many years, I was sort of stuck in the same pattern every day, and a lot of that had to do with me being in a pattern of fear. I've always been a really sort of fear-based person, and I've struggled a lot with pretty severe anxiety for many years of my life, and I'm finally at a point where I've decided that that I could do this, that I could take this on, and I wanted to do it as a way of challenging myself. And this was something that I really specifically knew would be a big challenge for me, going off in a direction like this that's really non-conventional. So let me go back to my experience of living in the Pacific Northwest. That's an incredibly beautiful area, and it's just, Seattle is an amazing city, apart from a few downsides like the weather and the dark winters. But the cost of living had gotten out of control. I had moved there. I've actually lived there a couple different times, but the longest stretch I moved there back in the late 90s, and it was actually still fairly affordable. But even at that time, trying to buy something was still fairly prohibitive. By the time I left Seattle 5 years ago, the median home price was well over $500,000. And now, just this past year, it's gotten up to about $850,000 for just a relatively, kind of mediocre type of home. It's incredibly crazy. So being a self-employed person, I've been self-employed for a very long time, buying a home just seemed like a daunting thing. And for various reasons, I never really got into that. And the anxiety issue, sort of the debilitating levels of anxiety that I had for a long time, played into that. So I got to the point where in 2013, I realized that living in an apartment in Seattle was too prohibitive. I had an incredibly cute little studio apartment that I was paying over $800 for, closer to $850 for. And I just thought, this is ridiculous. I'm paying all this money so that I can live in an amazing area, but I was working so much just to try and pay the rent and all the other expenses that came with living in a very expensive place like that, it didn't make sense for me to keep living there. And the cost of living were rising while my income just was not rising at the same level. So I decided to leave. I'm from Utah, and I decided to move back to Salt Lake where the cost of living was more manageable. But even at the same time, in that area, the cost of living has been rising. So I was living in an apartment that was a little bit cheaper, but I was still, like a lot of people, struggling with the rent trap. Or if you're paying a very expensive mortgage and having all the costs of a home, it would be the same thing. And I thought about trying to find a really inexpensive home to buy. And I knew if I did that, if I found something inexpensive, it would be way out of the way in an area that I may not want to live in, or it would be a fixer-upper. And frankly, I am just not a fixer-upper type of person. I am super do-it-yourself challenged. I've never been that kind of person. But I'll talk about that in context of the RV, because I've actually ended up having to develop some of my do-it-yourself skills in order to work with it. And I'll specifically talk about my solar as part of that. But I decided about 3 years ago, it was really weighing on me. And I started trying to find something that would allow me to live reasonably within my means, and that could also be something that was my own, that wasn't astronomically expensive. I didn't want to get into a 30-year mortgage, and it just was not something that I wanted to do. So I began noticing the tiny house movement, and a lot of people were becoming interested in it for the very same reasons that I was interested in it. And I thought, this is really incredible. So I was doing a lot of research into the tiny homes, and there were some tiny homes, some manufacturers of tiny homes that were making models that I loved. And I had always had relatively small apartments, or I had been with roommates where I was only living in a room, and I just never felt the need to have a huge space. And currently, most of the homes that are being built in this area are enormous. And again, it goes back to the thing of buying an older home that was smaller, that would need a lot of work and fixing up, and all the costs that would be involved with that. And I just thought, it's just not doable. So I ended up looking at this tiny house movement really in earnest for about a year. And it just dawned on me that the challenges with that were going to make it prohibitive. As awesome as they are, they have the challenge of trying to find a piece of land to put them on. And many municipalities make it very difficult for tiny homes and owners of tiny homes. And so that was something that really just sort of put the kibosh on that. But at the same time, in all of my searches, I was beginning to notice people that were taking old buses and renovating them and building them into what were essentially tiny homes on wheels. And people were traveling and being incredibly creative with that. And that really appealed to me. I struggled with that because in the many videos that I watched, people were doing all of this work. And again, my challenge of just being a do-it-yourself naive person. I kind of joke with myself that I have DIDS, do-it-yourself deficiency syndrome. And I would watch these videos of people constructing them and renovating them, and I would just be bewildered. Oh my gosh, I don't have that kind of skill. So, and that actually kind of applied to many of the tiny homes that I was seeing also. I looked at going and going to a workshop to maybe learn how to build it, but trying to build one of these things from scratch, I just knew that wasn't going to work for me. So as the bus conversion thing, I was doing research into that. I was noticing people doing the van conversions. And again, I was looking at those with a lot of interest, but the same problems were showing up. My incredible challenge with tools and knowing how to build things. But I really wanted to tackle it. So the RV started to show up. RVs were showing up in searches, and I was thinking, this is really interesting. I had never even considered an RV. They were things I would see on the road. They were things that people owned, but it was just never something I had ever considered. And it's amazing to me that I had never considered it, because I've always been a really nomadic person. And I would be with roommates, and I would move to another situation, or I would have an apartment and I would be there for a while, and I would end up moving to another place, and I would never be really fully grounded. And that was basically my entire adult life, just never really feeling and being grounded. And I think a lot of that had to do with sort of the issues with anxiety and fear that I had. But as a kid, we ended up moving a lot. By the time I was 20 or so, and I moved to Seattle for the first time, I think I'd moved like 7 times. So we'd move someplace, I'd get established, and we'd uproot, and I'd move another place. And so I kind of had this nomadic thing going on in me already. And then it dawned on me, I'm self-employed, I'm not married, I don't have kids, I don't have these attachments that are keeping me stuck to a particular place. Why didn't I think about this sort of this vehicle living thing where I would be able to pick up and move someplace? The ability to work from the road, the technology is all there. And it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And I wish I had gone back 5 years and started doing that sooner, but it just wasn't there. I was stuck in sort of a traditional pattern of how you're supposed to live. And at the same time, I was becoming really fascinated with this concept of off-grid living. And like sort of the bus conversion and the tiny home thing, as intriguing as it was, it seemed unreachable. So when the RV thing started to show up and I was looking at people that were living in RVs and I was noticing them using solar setups, I thought, that's really interesting. But it wasn't really until about 1.5 years ago that I really began in earnest to look at the RV as a real possibility. I was coming to the end. I knew that about 6 months into my last lease, I thought, I've got to do this. I've really got to commit myself to making a change here. And that was going to be a challenge because I knew that would really push a lot of fear buttons in me. People that live with anxiety tend to get into patterns that they repeat over and over and over again. And I'm talking about daily living types of patterns. I would get up in the morning, go to a coffee shop and at work, and I would go to the gym and I would come home. And that was the pattern. And that was something that I was comfortable in. And it's what I referred to as the velvet trap. It was that thing that was comfortable, but I was stuck in it. And it was the trap that is comfortable and it's hard to get out of because of that comfort. But I knew my life wasn't going to change, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to do more interesting things in life if I stayed in that. And the thought of buying a condo or a home where I was going to get into a long-term financial commitment, being a self-employed person where you're constantly kind of anxious and worried about money, was something that I just did not want to do. So I committed myself finally about 1 year ago to really earnestly looking at RVs. And I looked in local classifieds and I began exploring RVs by traveling in about 100-mile radius all around. I was going all over the place looking at RVs. And I had no experience apart from watching YouTube videos to try and learn what to look for. And I looked at a lot of RVs. And especially the first ones that I looked at gave me some experience in what to look for. Water damage as an example. I learned to go feel the walls and look for visible signs of water damage, and a number of RVs that I looked at clearly had some water damage. One in particular, a Class C, had openings that light could come through and I could see, and so that kind of helped me to figure out what to look for. But it was still a challenge, and it really scared the crap out of me, to be honest. Again, moving myself out into a direction that would really, really challenge me. But frankly, that was part of what it was all about for me. It was making a change in my life that would push me in a new direction and give me the potential for some really incredible new sort of adventure. And so I looked at a lot of different RVs, and I knew that I was not going to be able to afford a new RV as much as I would love to. As much as I would love to have spent $35,000 on a new RV, I knew that wasn't in the cards for me. And so I ended up looking at RVs that were in the 80s and early to mid 90s. And I found that in fact there were a fair crop of them out there that were in still pretty good shape. And so I focused my efforts on those. And I even allowed myself to test drive and look at some RVs that were from the late 70s. And in fact, I found a couple that were in remarkable condition, the people that had owned them. But I just decided I didn't want to go back that far. So in the end, 2 weeks before my lease was up, I was getting really nervous, but I ended up finding one that was in just a short distance of where my dad lived, and that was ideal. I was fortunate in that I had a supportive family. When I told them this, they didn't freak out and think I was a complete nut. And I found a 1985 26-foot Chevy Mallard that for the bulk of its life had been owned by one person who had taken pretty good care of it, had 45,000 miles on it, which I felt was a good number of miles. I had read that people say if you find something that has too low of a miles, to stay away from that, something that has too high a miles. Well, I had also, at the same time, I had been entertaining the idea of a van conversion. And so I had been looking at much newer vans, but they ended up all having very high miles. Cargo vans and even passenger vans, the ones that were in the price range that I was looking at, even if they were several decades newer, ended up having very high miles. And that made me a little bit nervous. So 2 weeks before my lease was up, I ended up buying the current RV that I'm in right now. And it was in pretty good shape. It had a couple of small areas of water damage. The Class C overhang had some water damage up at the front, but I wasn't too worried about that because that was just going to be an area of storage that I was going to enclose. And there was one small area below a window. But I felt every inch of every other part of the RV and there was nothing. It was very solid. I had looked at a couple of RVs that had clear issues with mold, and I could smell them and I could sense them. And that gave me a really good sense about what to look for in that area. One of the challenges that I had and that was fearful for me was I was really worried about the smell. It did have a little bit of that old sort of musty RV smell. And I'll do a separate video where I'll talk about that and how I ended up dealing with it, because by and large I've been able to get rid of that. And so I'm pretty close to the cusp of getting out and beginning to travel. I've been stationary for the past 8 months while I've lived in it, which has helped me to be able to do some of the renovation work, like painting as an example, and some other work. And I've been running off solar setup, so I'm going to do some videos on that because I think a lot of people are very interested about this. And I will say that with the solar setup, concurrent to the other work that I was doing in trying to understand RVs and learn them, I was learning about electricity, because I was like a lot of people. I knew next to nothing about electricity. Electricity was something that came from a wall outlet and I would plug in and there was the electricity. And when you live in an apartment or a home, you just plug in and there's that electricity, and you don't think too much about it until the end of the month when you get a power bill and you pay it. And you know you've used a lot of electricity because it's higher. But I really didn't have a concept about electricity, but I do now, because I'm running off a solar setup and I've got a battery monitor, which I'll do a video on, and it gives me very precise feedback about how much electricity that I'm using. So I was beginning to research just the very basics of electricity, because when you do have a solar setup, it does require a little bit more understanding of electricity in order to monitor what you're doing. I needed to understand watts and volts and amps. These were three terms that you hear, but I never really had much of a concept of it. I would see, you would have the typical 60-watt light bulb, for instance, and you'd be in a home and you would see people with 60-watt light bulbs, but I just really didn't have a concept about how much electricity that was. And I will say now that I'm running a solar setup, that has much more meaning to me. And on any given night, my power usage is between 50 and 100 watts, which is pretty amazing. And I'm going to do a video where I describe that and I show you how I know it and some of the power saving things that you can do. So I'm on the cusp of getting out and traveling, and it is scaring me, I'll tell you that. I mean, this is challenging me. This is bringing up some of the issues of fear that I have and anxiety, and I've been moving through them. When I first moved into the RV, I had a lot of anxiety. And even in the weeks before that, I had a serious amount of anxiety. I really worried that I had made the most horrible mistake. And I was really, really worried. But I've been able to deal with a lot of the issues, and I've had some engine work done. I've had it checked over by a mechanic, actually several mechanics, and And so I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I've learned, and hopefully to be able to pass off that information to anyone else who is looking at going in this direction and wanting to give this a try. At the very least, in the time that I've owned this RV, not paying rent has already paid for the RV. I paid $4,500 for the RV, and I've had about $1,700 of engine and chassis work done. I replaced the radiator. The radiator itself was totally functional, the original radiator, but the neck had become damaged and they couldn't repair it. And I was looking at having a weld job done on it, but that was no guarantee. And so I decided to spend the money to have a brand new radiator put in, which is actually a little bit larger, a little bit more capacity than the original radiator. Had the back brakes done so it could pass safety and emissions. The heater core in the dashboard needed to be repaired. And there was a blown fuse for the fan that powered the dash. Those things have all been repaired. There was a minor oil leak in the gas pan that I've had fixed. I knew there would be a few issues like that, and I've dealt with that. And I've gotten used to driving it, which was an incredible challenge at first because I was used to driving a small Honda Fit. Looking back, I really wish 5 years ago I had really thought of it. It just was not within my awareness to do that. But I want to thank you for watching my channel. I'm going to begin doing some other videos on things that I've done and to renovate, to make it more like a tiny home, because right now this is my tiny home. And it is in a lot of ways the tiny home that I would have built, that I could have put on a piece of land. But now I'll be able to go and travel and explore and record my adventures, which is a big part of my plan. So I want to thank you for watching this video, and please subscribe to my channel.